Let me tell you how it all unraveled. Hey, I'm Brett. I've always been a black and white kind of guy, especially when it comes to relationships. You're either committed or you're not. No gray areas, no justifications. You stay loyal, or you leave. Simple. For 4 years, I thought my marriage with Sandy was solid. She's sharp, works in marketing, and knows how to command a room. We weren't the dramatic couple. No screaming fights, no wild accusations. Just us, our inside jokes, and our routines. Nothing felt shaky. At least I thought so. But there was always one thing that never sat right with me. Her best friend, Melissa. Melissa was blindly loyal to Sandy, the kind of friend who'd justify anything she did. If Melissa burned a house down, Sandy would blame the wind. I laughed it off before. Everyone has that one friend, right? Then last week happened. We were at a dinner party. One of Sandy's work friends hosted it. I didn't know most people there, so I hovered near the bar, half listening to conversations. Then, I heard Melissa's voice cut through the noise. Loud, confident, careless. Honestly, cheating on Greg is so easy. He's too busy worshiping me to even notice. She laughed like it was a joke, like it was funny. I froze. Did I mishear? But no. She kept going, talking about how predictable he was, how she flirted with other guys just to keep things interesting. People around her chuckled, nodding along, like it was nothing. Greg wasn't my best friend, but I knew him. A decent guy. He looked at Melissa like she hung the damn moon. And here she was, treating him like an accessory. It sat in my gut all night. I didn't bring it up at the party, no. Point making a scene. But the thought wouldn't leave me. Days later, when it was just me and Sandy at home, I finally brought it up. I overheard something at the party, I started. Melissa was joking about cheating on Greg. Sandy barely glanced up from her phone. Yeah? Like I'd just told her tomorrow's weather. She said it's easy because he's so into her. That's messed up, right? Sandy shrugged. Greg's kind of boring, Brett. I mean, he's nice, but he's not exactly thrilling. Melissa's always been a free spirit. She's just exploring. It's not like they're married. Her tone was so casual, like it was nothing. So that makes it okay? I asked, sharper now. She's betraying him. You think that's fine because he's boring? Sandy sighed, finally setting her phone down. I'm not saying it's ideal, but Greg doesn't challenge her. He's clingy, insecure. You can't expect someone like Melissa to stay interested if she's not getting what she needs. I stared at her. What she needs is to not string along a guy she doesn't respect. Sandy rolled her eyes. It's not that black and white. Relationships are complicated. And that's when something shifted. Because to me, it isn't complicated. You either cheat or you don't. You either respect the person you're with or you don't. I leaned forward. If you caught me cheating on you, would you say, oh, maybe Brett's just bored, it's understandable? For the first time, her expression tightened, just for a second. Then she shook her head. That's not the same. How isn't it? Because you're not Melissa, she said, like that explained everything. She's different. She doesn't do well with routine. Greg doesn't give her what she needs. So she cheats? I cut in. And you're defending it? She exhaled, annoyed. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying there's more to it. I sat back, watching her, and something cold settled in my chest. Not because of Melissa, because of Sandy. Because of the way she talked about betrayal like it was just another decision. Something you could explain away if you had the right reasons. And suddenly, I wondered, if she ever felt that way about me, what would her reason be? That thought wouldn't leave me. Not that night, not even now. Because once you see someone justify betrayal, you start wondering if you're just another excuse waiting to happen. All of a sudden, I'm not even sure where her boundaries lie anymore. Hey, I'm Sandy. Melissa has been my best friend since college. We met in our freshman year. She strolled into class late, no notebook, no worries, and sat beside me like we were already old friends. That's Melissa. Loud, fearless, full of life. She could convince you to ditch a lecture, book last-minute flights, or sneak into concerts, without a second thought. I've always been the opposite. The planner, the one who kept us from flunking out. Melissa thrived on spontaneity, and I kept things from spiraling out of control. Somehow it worked. A balance. She's always had this wild energy, like she refuses to be tied down. Rules, expectations. She bends them, twists them, or ignores them entirely. People either struggle to keep up with her or they put her on a pedestal. Greg is the second kind. Greg is a nice guy, no one could say otherwise. He's got a steady IT job, he's polite, dependable. But honestly, he's dull, predictable to a fault, the type who maps out his whole future before 30 and never strays from the plan. He adores Melissa, no question, always saying yes, always there when she calls. And honestly, I think that's the issue. Melissa isn't built for routine. She needs excitement, something Greg just can't offer. So when I heard her casually joke about cheating, it didn't even faze me. That's just how she is. She doesn't settle. She keeps her options open. And to be honest, it didn't seem wrong. People treat relationships like these strict contracts. Once you're in, you're stuck forever, no breathing room. I don't see it that way. Would I cheat? No, I hate dishonesty. But I understand why some people do. Sometimes you have to explore to figure out what really makes you happy. So when Brett brought it up, acting like it was some huge betrayal, I didn't get why he was so worked up. We were sitting at home when he mentioned Melissa's comment, expecting me to be outraged. But I wasn't. It's just Melissa. Nothing new. But the way Brett stared at me, like I'd said something truly awful, threw me off. Greg's boring, I told him, because it was the truth. Melissa just needs more. His expression hardened. So cheating's okay as long as you're bored? His voice was sharp, almost disgusted. I rolled my eyes. It's not ideal, but Greg doesn't challenge her. That's part of the problem, and that's when things got weird. Brett didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just looked at me. He just sat there, silent. His eyes locked on me like he didn't recognize who I was. I tried laughing it off, cracking a joke to ease the tension, but he didn't even flinch. Just kept staring like I had crossed some invisible line I didn't even know existed. I've always known Brett sees the world in black and white. To him, cheating isn't just wrong. It's an unbreakable rule, no exceptions. Me? I've never looked at it that way. Life is complicated. People are flawed. Sometimes bending the rules is the only way to stay sane. But his expression, cold, unreadable, made me question if he was seeing something else entirely. Like he was reassessing who I really was. I brushed it off in the moment. He'd get over it. After all, we weren't talking about us. This was about Melissa and Greg. Their marriage had nothing to do with ours. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the way he looked at me. Like I was a stranger. Like some wall had appeared between us, thick and impenetrable. I barely blinked, sleep completely, out of reach. Melissa's words echoed in my head, playing on a loop. Greg's boring. If Melissa wants more, that's his problem. At first, I thought it was just about them. But then I realized it wasn't. It was about how Sandy viewed relationships, how she might even view me. By morning, everything felt heavy. Moving felt like dragging a weight behind me. Coffee tasted like nothing. I scrolled through my phone at the kitchen table, not really seeing anything. Then she walked in, hair messy, rubbing her eyes like she hadn't lost a second of sleep. She glanced at me and rolled her eyes. Are you seriously still upset about last night? She scoffed, grabbing a mug like it was just another ordinary morning. You're being so judgmental, Brett. Not everything is black and white. Relationships aren't these rigid, old-school things where no one ever strays. Something inside me clicked. I set my phone down, looking at her directly. So, what if I cheat? Her head snapped up. What? I kept my voice calm. If I ever find you boring, if I ever feel like I'm not excited enough, would it be okay for me to step out too? She stared at me like I had just slapped her. That's completely different, Brett, she snapped. Don't even start with that. Why? What if I did it too? She stiffened, crossed her arms, instantly defensive. Melissa's situation isn't the same. Women have different needs, and men don't, I cut in. The words sat there, heavy. She fumbled for a response, her voice sharper now. You're better than that, Brett. Don't compare yourself to Melissa. And that was it. The moment of clarity. This wasn't about Melissa and Greg anymore. She didn't respect Greg. She saw him as weak, predictable, boring. And if that's how she looked at him, what was stopping her from seeing me the same way? What happens when I stop being interesting enough? I sat there just looking at her. No anger, no yelling, just something colder. A door quietly closing in my mind. She kept talking, trying to explain, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I saw her now, clearly, without the filters, without the excuses, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't like what I saw. I didn't say anything else. There was no point. She wouldn't hear it anyway. So I got up, rinsed my mug in the sink, and walked out. I already knew where this was headed. At first, I thought he was just sulking. Brett always goes quiet when he's upset, but he snaps out of it after a day or two. So when he barely spoke the next morning and left early, I figured I'd just give him some space. But days passed, and nothing changed. He wasn't mad. He was distant, like something inside him had shut down. He still went to work, ate dinner, watched TV, but it was like I wasn't even there. He barely touched me, barely looked at me. One night I tried to keep it casual. Hey, you okay? You been kinda quiet. He just shrugged, eyes still on the screen. Just thinking about things. That was it. I laughed a little, trying to lighten the mood. Well, think faster. You're no fun like this. He smiled, but it was forced, empty. A pit started forming in my stomach. I tried harder after that. Booked us a fancy dinner one weekend, suggested a little getaway. He agreed, but it felt off, like he was just going through the motions. At night, when I reached for him, he didn't pull away. But he didn't lean in either. No warmth. No spark. I mentioned it to Melissa over coffee one afternoon. He's been weird lately. Like really weird. She waved it off. Men are always dramatic. You probably bruised his ego. Give it a week. But this wasn't about ego. Brett wasn't sulking. It felt like he had already checked out. And then one night, it happened. We were sitting in the living room. We both sat there, pretending to scroll through our phones, the silence stretching between us. Then he cleared his throat. I want a divorce. I blinked, certain I had misheard. What? Brett looked straight. At me, his expression unreadable. I want a divorce. The words hit me like ice water. My heart pounded against my ribs as I set my phone down, shaking my head. What are you even talking about? We had one argument. It's not just one argument, he interrupted, his voice steady. It's bigger than that. Panic coiled in my chest. Brett, come on. You're overreacting. I was just venting. You know I love you. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. It's not about whether you love me. It's about how you see loyalty, commitment, what you said. It showed me we're not on the same page. I shook my head harder this time, trying to make him see reason. You're basing all of this on something I said about Melissa? Brett, I don't cheat. I've never cheated. I know, he said quietly, but it's how easily you dismissed it. How you defended it. That's not something I can ignore. I pushed myself to my feet, pacing, my hands trembling. I was just talking. You're acting like I did something unforgivable. He stood too, but there was no heat in his voice. No anger. Just finality. "I can't trust someone who doesn't think betrayal is a big deal," he said. "I've been thinking about this for a while. My mind's made up." My throat tightened. "Brett, please. You're throwing everything away over one conversation. We can fix this." He gave me a look. Sad, but resolute. "I don't want to fix it. I'm done." It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized he was already gone, and for the first time I understood. I had lost him completely. Ending my marriage wasn't a sudden decision. It was the result of months, maybe years, of realizations, bubbling beneath the surface until they finally boiled over. Once I admitted the truth to myself, there was no going back. I handled things methodically. First, I consulted a lawyer, ensuring the process would be as smooth as possible. No kids. Simple finances. A shared lease that would be easy to dissolve. The path was clear. Next, I found a new place, a modest one-bedroom across town. Small, but mine. I furnished it simply. A couch, a bed, a dining table. The walls were bare, the rooms quiet. But for the first time in years, the emptiness felt like freedom. When I finally told Sandy, she was blindsided. "You're really ending our marriage? Over this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and frustration. "It's not just this," I said calmly. "It's about our values, how we see commitment. I can't be with someone who doesn't view loyalty the same way I do." She tried to argue, to rationalize her perspective, but my decision was final. Trust had eroded, and without it, everything else crumbled. Melissa wasn't far behind. She called me soon after. "Brett, you're being ridiculous," she scoffed over the phone. "You're throwing everything away over a difference of opinion. Marriage is about compromise." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Compromise?" I echoed. "Is that what you call what you're doing to Greg?" She went quiet. "That's different," she said defensively. "No, it's not," I countered. "You've convinced Sandy that betrayal is acceptable. That commitment is flexible. I won't live like that. And honestly, I feel sorry for Greg." "Don't bring him into this," she snapped. But it was too late. The mirror had been held up and the reflection wasn't flattering. In the months that followed, I embraced solitude. My new apartment became a sanctuary. I started running again, each stride on the pavement clearing my mind. I cooked simple meals, read books that had gathered dust for years. Every day was a step forward, toward healing, toward rediscovering who I was outside of a fractured relationship. Mutual friends mentioned Sandy from time to time. "She's struggling," they said. "She's realizing Melissa's influence was toxic." Their friendship isn't what it used to be. I didn't take pleasure in her hardship, but I couldn't ignore the irony. She had defended infidelity, rationalized betrayal, and now she was standing on the receiving end of its consequences. Time moved forward, as it always does. One afternoon at work, I found myself in an unexpected conversation with a colleague, Rachel. Lunch breaks turned into long talks after meetings. She was insightful, grounded, with a sense of integrity that resonated with me. There was a depth to her that I hadn't encountered in a long time, and for the first time in years, I felt something. I thought I'd lost hope Brett as. We lingered after a team dinner. Rachel asked about my past relationships. I hesitated for a moment, but decided honesty was the best approach. I was married once. I was committed. But it ended because we had fundamentally different views on what commitment actually meant. She nodded thoughtfully. Commitment is everything. Without it, there's no trust, no foundation. Her words felt like a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. As our connection deepened, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led me here. The pain of the past had been a crucible, burning away illusions and leaving behind a sharper understanding of what I needed, what I valued. Rachel embodied those qualities, not just in words, but in action. Looking back, the lessons were clear. Sandy had always championed the idea that infidelity was subjective, that loyalty was negotiable. But when faced with the actual, tangible loss of our marriage, the abstract became painfully real. It's ironic. She defended betrayal so fiercely until it cost her everything. Sandy, a year feels longer when you're the one left behind. At first, I thought Brett was bluffing. People don't throw away years together over one conversation, right? I figured he'd cool off, stay mad for a while, but eventually he'd come around. That's how it always worked. I'd charm him, apologize in my own way, and we'd move past it. But this time, he didn't. I didn't realize how final his silence would be until weeks passed. No texts, no calls. His absence filled every room. Pressing on my chest like something heavy I couldn't shake, Melissa kept telling me it wasn't a big deal. "He's dramatic," she scoffed. "Men hate when women don't stroke their egos. Give it time." I clung to that at first, convinced I could fix it. I made plans, reached out, invited him to dinner, tried to talk it through like adults. Each time he politely declined, or ignored me altogether. And slowly, it sank in. This wasn't about a bruised ego. Brett wasn't angry. He was done. Melissa's reassurances started sounding hollow. I noticed how often she talked over me, how her advice always circled back to making herself feel better, not me. I watched the way she treated Greg, dismissive, entitled, smug, and I couldn't shake Brett's words. I feel sorry for Greg. For months I brushed it off, buried myself in distractions, nights out, casual, dates, pretending I was fine. But the house felt empty. My phone barely rang anymore. And now, I'm alone. No excitement. No one left to impress. Sometimes I scroll through old photos, wondering how I couldn't see it back then. Brett, steady as ever. Always showing up, always loyal. I used to think that made him predictable. Safe. Now, I'd give anything for safe. A year later, I finally get it. It wasn't just about what Melissa did, or even what I said. It was about respect, about knowing when you've crossed a line so far, there's no coming back. And the worst part? Realizing, too, late that the person who cared the most isn't coming back either.